Over to you, Geetika.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to what promises to be an extremely engaging and meaningful discussion today. At TIE, we have been bringing you a series of sessions over the last 3 months, and we hope you have found them useful. We have another one tomorrow and a couple of other interesting ones lined up in the month later. We also have our marquee India Internet Day on 7th and 8th August in a completely virtual format. So do keep yourselves updated by visiting delhi.tie.org and tieinstitute.in. Coming to the session today on building resilient supply chains in a post-COVID world, we're absolutely delighted and thrilled to partner with Delhivery to bring this discussion to you. We really couldn't have asked for a better set of speakers than what we have today. So I will quickly introduce them briefly and hand over the stage to them for the discussions. Helping us moderate and lead the discussion today is Anjali Bansal, founder of Avaana Capital. She is also the former non-executive chairperson of Dena Bank and chairs the Niti Aayog Investment Council for FinTech and Women Entrepreneurship. She was previously the global partner and managing director at TPG Growth Private Equity and strategy consultant with McKinsey. She's an active mentor, active investor in companies like Nika, Urban Company, LoanTap, CoverFox, and serves as an independent non-executive director on the board of leading companies like Tata Power, Siemens, Bata, Delhivery. She was also previously on the board of FWWB and continues to be an advisor to Seva Bank, a charter member of TIE, very happy to share that. And she's on the managing committee of the Indian Venture Capital Association. She is a mentor to Facebook. She leads tech and has been listed as one of the most powerful women in business, in Indian business, by a leading publication like Business Today and Fortune India. Welcome, Anjali. Thanks for being with us today. Next, we have Sahil Barua, CEO and co-founder at Delhivery, who's responsible for setting the overall strategic direction of the company. He also works closely with the engineering and product teams. Prior to Delhivery, Sahil began his career as a strategy consultant at Bain and Company and worked on growth strategy, M&A, and performance improvement across sectors. We have someone with us who's very well known in the investment and startup ecosystem, Neeraj Bharadwaj, MD at Carlyle Asia Partners Advisory Team, who's focused on large growth capital and buyout opportunities across sectors in India. Before joining Carlyle, Neeraj was MD at Axel Partners Growth Investing Operations in India. And prior to that, he was MD and country head for Apex. Welcome, Neeraj. Pleasure to have you here. Next, our panelist is somebody who I think our audiences here are very, very keen to hear from. Munish, Varma, managing partner at SoftBank Investment Advisors in London, who's responsible for the Vision Fund's Indian investments. He's on the board of some of India's fastest growing companies. And in addition, he is focused on the fintech and insurtech sectors across Europe. And he led the fund's investment in Oak North. He joined SoftBank from Deutsche Bank, from where he held multiple roles across global markets and wealth management. Pleasure to have you here, Munish. Thanks for being with us. And from the other side of the table, we have Vivek Gambhir, Director, Godrej Consumer Products. He's a senior executive with deep experience as CEO, Chief Strategy Officer, and partner in FMCG and management consulting in India, US, and Singapore. Prior to this, he was the Chief Strategy Officer for Godrej Industries and was also the founding member of Bain and Company Consulting Operations in India. After the engaging discussion that Anjali will help us go through over this hour, do put in your questions in the Q&A box, and we will try and see as many as can be taken up, time permitting. With that, over to you, Anjali. It's all yours. Anjali, just unmute yourself so that your volume. Yes, thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Geetika. And as a long-standing TIE charter member, I'm so delighted to see TIE and Delhivery come together for this, I think, absolutely timely, topical discussion. Also delighted to have my co-panelists here. Many of us are colleagues on various boards and other industry initiatives. So I think COVID, even if you look back to the beginning of this year, we were hearing about COVID, something happening in China, and starting to see the effect of that in our companies and our supply chains and boardrooms. But by the time March rolled around, we were in the middle of a global pandemic. It has been an absolutely unprecedented situation. No amount of sort of brain power has been able to forecast what will happen next. There is no playbook. Whether it is governments or companies or society, as a whole, we are actually creating a new script as we go along, day by day, week by week, and month by month. So in this context, I think the discussion topic for today is particularly relevant. As the lockdown in India and other parts of the world started unfolding, one of the things we saw coming up quickly in boards as well as across sort of C-suites is the impact on supply chain. And having spent the last 2 decades, 3 decades globally, thinking about globally distributed supply chains and domestically as well, the interruption, the sudden immediate interruption in supply chain was quite dramatic. Everything from getting access to your groceries to components and inputs for your manufacturing operations and companies, in the pharma space, in automotive, as well as other spaces. I think the effect, the supply chain interruption effect, was felt at a very individual as well as market level. So that is on the one hand. On the other hand, what we saw was a dramatic acceleration of digitalization. So we saw this quickly, that companies and businesses that had invested in digitizing their operations, not just thinking about sort of e-commerce or a horizontal vertical silo of digital, but really bringing in digital capability, they seemed to actually recover much faster and cope with this. So that is the context really for our discussion today, creating enduring resilient supply chains. I'm delighted, as I had mentioned, I think we have such a knowledgeable group. I'm not sure we will do justice, but we shall try. So I'm actually going to start with you, Munish. Munish joins us, he's in London. And with your perch and your global view right now, what are you seeing around the world in terms of shifting business models and paradigms, and certainly supply chains, but more broadly as well?
Oh, sure. Thank you for having me here. It's a pleasure to be on this panel today, Anjali. So look, you alluded to some of it, right, in your opening remarks. I think technology, if you go back last few years, the adoption of technology and technology-enabled solutions was accelerating over time, right? What this pandemic and what the last few months have shown us is that acceleration itself has gone accelerated. So the shift from, and you made the point about businesses that were considered digital, but in the context of having a nice user interface, etc., but the core operations of the businesses were not digital. Those businesses are struggling, but businesses that have accepted and have, sort of led with technology are actually doing much better in this environment. So what that means is, to my mind at least, that consumer behavior has fundamentally shifted, right? And it's shifted across different sectors. This adoption has become much more prevalent. And if you look at sort of examples of this, and you can pick different sectors, right? If you can look at food delivery, for example, an entire stack from, online grocery delivery to dark kitchens. Go back 3, 4, 5 years, there were people ordering online groceries, but people that were of a slightly older generation perhaps were not. Today, that's different. Today, my parents order online groceries, right? Education is another great example of where this is having a fundamental shift. Education was, to my mind, inching towards a hybrid model, which was going to be offline and online. But I think we just seem to have leapfrogged that model. A large part of education now will get delivered in online formats. So I think consumer behavior in these sectors, entertainment is another case in point, right? Subscription services, look at Netflix and look at, the number of subscribers they've managed to get onto the platform and other services. So I think these fundamental shifts in consumer behavior, which were going to happen over time in any case, have all been accelerated with this pandemic. So when you're looking at investment decisions, you're looking hard to see where is technology really being used as a competitive mode, as a differentiating factor, and it has to mean more than just a shiny user interface.
Thank you, Munish. Neeraj, also with your investor hat on, you have been involved in such a breadth of businesses and industry verticals, both sort of your traditional tech and non-tech. What are you seeing, both in terms of, in some ways, sort of the challenges that businesses have faced, as well as opportunities coming out of this?
Well, thank you. Thanks for having me on the panel. So I would agree with Munish, right? That even if you take the case of India, I think in the last 8 weeks, we've leapt forward maybe 5 or 7 years in terms of digital adoption within consumers as well as businesses. I mean, whether it's online payments, whether it's distance learning, online learning, whether it's telemedicine, whether you think of groceries taking online orders, it's a totally different world today. And, having the purview of being in the Carlyle Asia Fund, which has a large presence in China, what we've seen is that these, as Munish said, customer adoption and behavior has changed. It doesn't return to what it was before, right? And so I think specific case points would be one. Obviously, online is a much larger part today of the purchase bucket than it was earlier. Secondly, people have become more cost conscious, right? So there's a lot more comparison shopping today than there was earlier as an example, in China. I think thirdly, customer safety, which was never really an issue for businesses, they never really thought about that, has become paramount, right? So if you're doing online deliveries, you actually have to carry a health card showing when you got your last test, what was your fever level, right? That is just a totally different model than what has been thought about before, but that's not changing, right? I think fourthly, if I think about it, everyone used to talk about digitally enabling their businesses, right? Which is take an existing bricks and mortar business and make it digital. I think the paradigm has shifted. The digital has to underpin everything you're doing today, right? And that has implications both in terms of your architecture, right? So whether it's collaboration tools, cloud, as examples, right? SaaS software, I think that's one bucket. I think thirdly, increasingly, you'll see, and we're seeing it right now, a disaggregation between the physical and data, right? So you think about oil and how oil is traded. The physical movement of oil has nothing to do with how oil is traded. I think similarly and increasingly in most products, you'll see that disaggregation happening because supply chains no longer resilient. And then I think thirdly, you have to think about businesses which are going to be personalized and omni-channel, right? It's not going to go back to a world where one format only works. So I think those are some of the sea changes which we've all seen in these last 8 weeks, even in the Indian context. But I think these are long-lasting changes which will create opportunities for new businesses, but also will lead to the demise of certain ones who can't adapt.
Indeed. Vivek, turning to you. I know we all came together in a cross-industry initiative very early in the lockdown exactly to keep the essential supply chain moving. So from those days to now, you see everything that's happening in the consumer space. So consumer trends, preferences, demand, at the same time, the enterprise response to that. So I'm going to ask you a little bit of a double-barreled question, which is this situation more of a challenge versus I feel it's a bit more of an opportunity for businesses to start thinking about new consumer interfaces and models. So what has your experience and what your thinking is? And secondly, how do you actually see the use of supply chain as a strategic advantage when you start thinking about new consumer preferences and different ways of reaching your consumer? On mute, Vivek.
Thank you, Anjali. Great to be on this panel. And I hope that everyone's families are safe and well. I think both Munish and Neeraj have laid out some great points in terms of how consumer behavior and adoption is accelerating, the importance of safety, how digital is becoming a very important part of the ecosystem, the aggregation of data, and how omnichannel is becoming more important. What's happened, Anjali, as you were mentioning, since the crisis began, was that I think we were all in some ways caught with our pants down. And so we were caught off guard simply because of the way the lockdown was announced. And honestly, we didn't know what we didn't know. And we probably don't even know a lot still. But what this required in the early days was extraordinary hustle and jugaad on the ground. We saw fantastic collaboration between sales and supply chain. And I think the great thing is that supply chain is finally being taken seriously in the consumer industry. Supply chain truly now has a seat at the table, which wasn't the case before, at least in the consumer industry, where typically sales and marketing actually ends up calling most of the shots. And a huge amount of focus in the beginning was getting manufacturing restarted, which required getting permissions, getting labor back and running, finding partners who we can support. So the entire name of the game was to really figure out how to get our operations up, how to get manufacturing up, and how to get supply up. And that really has been a significant competitive advantage for those companies, as you mentioned, who managed to get their act together, whether these were companies who had the scale or whether these were companies who had better tech in their operations. And I think where we are today is that the situation is still very challenging. The situation is getting better, but you are still seeing a lot of supply volatility. If your warehouse or your suppliers end up falling in a containment zone, suddenly for a couple of weeks, you may not be able to apply. So how you think about inventory norms, working capital norms, how you think about multiple suppliers, how do you think about visibility in the supply chain? Those are the challenges that companies are still struggling with. At the same time, the demand situation is quite fragile. For the FMCG industry, the top 6 states, which have been the most affected by COVID, actually comprise about 55% of the industry's volumes. So this is how, in some ways, concentrated the industry actually is. And the demand situation is quite fragile. Some consumers are reducing consumption. Some are dropping out of categories completely. So in the near term, I do believe that the challenges are more than the opportunity. But I think companies who can effectively ensure availability, can ensure that the products are available on the stores, will drive significant advantage. And I think through that advantage, if companies can start taking resilience as what you were mentioning seriously, coming out of this crisis, I do see, and typically you see this data, that the market share gaps between some leaders who find a way to navigate a downturn actually increases quite a bit. So coming out of this situation, I do believe that there will be a set of players who will be able to use the crisis to their advantage, and you will see a big opportunity. But right now, it's more challenge than opportunity.
Very interesting and lots of food for thought there. But using data as an advantage. Sahil, turning to you. When you and your teammates and co-founders started Delhivery, you did think about using data as an advantage in something which is not a new business, right? Logistics has been around forever. It's as old as business itself. You move things around. How has Delhivery actually used data, digital innovation to really reinvent the supply chain model in some ways? And then very specifically coming to this situation, you were one of the first companies to actually come back to almost full network capability, I think 15,000 zip codes in maybe 3 odd weeks. What worked for you and what has not worked in dealing with COVID?
Sure. Thanks, Anjali, for hosting this panel. It's great to be here. I'll start with the COVID situation and then talk about technology as opposed to the other way around. We were shut down on 24th of March when the lockdown was announced for the first 48 hours. And I remember we realized instantly that we would have to be operational again starting the 26th of March, because essentially as essential goods were going to start moving around the country, there would have to be a network which would have the ability to deliver these. And so our immediate priority starting the 26th was to figure out how to get capacity back across at least all of the major cities. And so in the first 5 days, we were back live in about 4,500 pin codes. And starting the 1st of April, we were live in nearly 15,500 pin codes. 2 or 3 things allowed us to do this. One, first and foremost, before technology, we are a large team, and we have 30,000 people and over 5,000 partners across the country. The first priority was obviously safety and communication with the entire team. And so instantly instituting the WHO guidelines for safety across all of our facilities, across the infrastructure we operate around the country, was priority 1. And the second was really communicating with the team about the seriousness of the situation that we were in. I think given that we also have operations in China, we had sort of had some time to prepare in any case. And so it was really communicating the seriousness of the situation, enforcing safety guidelines, ensuring rosters across all of our facilities and bringing the capacity back up. Now, once we've established that, the hard part was then actually navigating the ground situation. You know, as Vivek has already referred to it, I think the first week was Jugaad. And then, you know, from there on, our systems really began to kick in. One of the key areas where technology, or two key areas where technology has certainly helped us. The first is our data science teams actually kicked into action immediately on the 25th. And we were able to identify through a combination of two things. One is we essentially run massive machine learning models, which allow us to pinpoint the location of every consumer and business that we've delivered to in the past. What this allowed us to do was to build one of the most detailed maps of what containment zones and what different kinds of zones existed around the country. And so we knew exactly, you know, as the country started opening up as well, where was a red zone, where there was an orange zone, where there was a green zone, within a red zone, right down to, you know, which building had been shut down, because this was information that was coming to us from the field. What this allowed us to do, obviously, was to operate quite effectively, you know, in areas where other people were struggling with, you know, can I go and deliver a box there? Can I actually, will my distributor be, you know, will he be operational there? The second was a similar machine learning model, which allowed us to very quickly identify what goods were essential and not. And that allowed us also to go back to our clients, you know, whether they were in the FMCG space or in the pharma space, or even outside, even e-commerce companies as they started picking up in volume, as to whether their products were essential or not. Because if you remember in the early days, even that was a pretty big sort of point of confusion. You know, are we even shipping essential goods? For the longest time, I remember, for instance, you know, one of our clients is Lenskart. It wasn't clear whether eyeglasses were actually going to be essential goods or not. Unfortunately, you know, that actually was mandated. So those were two areas where technology obviously helped. From a delivery standpoint, the other place where it, of course, helps us is that when you look at logistics in India, it's largely been a sort of a people-driven industry where, you know, the average quality of infrastructure is not particularly great and operations are largely extremely manual. By virtue of having automated significantly and by virtue of having the software that orchestrates our supply chain and our operations, we are able to operate our facilities with much fewer people than comparable businesses, not just in India, but even across most of the world. And as a consequence of that, you know, our safety norms combined with the automation, combined with the ability to pinpoint exactly what to deliver where, we were able to sort of get back to some kind of normalcy. You know, I would point out, however, that like, you know, Vivek said, the situation, we've been able to come back to certain kind of normalcy. But the reality is that the challenges on the ground, you know, are actually immense. You know, right from coordinating with local authorities, navigating containment zones, they still spring up. Like Guwahati, for instance, has just been shut down. Chennai is just getting out of a lockdown on the 5th of July. And the labor situation, of course, continues to be a heavy challenge. And so we obviously have to continue to navigate those, but these are areas where tech has helped us quite a lot.
So going back to this, you know, through the course of the lockdown, and then I want to move beyond COVID and lockdown to what opportunities the world is going to throw at us in this new digital era, if you will. But just spending a minute on that, have you seen and what have you seen as new business models and access to consumer models emerge? Sahil, from the delivery, are there things that delivery is doing today that you weren't doing earlier?
Well, there are always things that delivery is doing that it wasn't doing.
That's true, actually. Why should I ask that? Well, let me rephrase the question immediately.
No, I think.
Are there things that you have seen shift because of rapid digitalization or direct to consumer or companies streamlining their supply chain and their approach to supply chain?
You know, all three of the panelists actually made this point earlier. I think what we are witnessing is sort of this dramatic time compression in terms of sort of the pace of change. For the pace of change. Vivek, you know, is absolutely right when he says supply chain was possibly one of the most overlooked functions at most enterprises. You know, what's happening now is increasingly we are seeing as companies are being forced to find new routes to their consumers because, you know, shops are still shut, distributors are still shut. and you still have to stay relevant in the marketplace. And so a lot of people are now starting to say, what is the fastest way for me to reach my consumers? We have FMCG customers who are thinking about how do we go direct to retail, how do we go direct to consumer. A number of direct to consumer brands actually have emerged in the last sort of 60, 70 days, where they were traditionally selling, either offline, or they were selling through modern retail, or they were selling through an Amazon or Flipkart. And now they're saying, we're just going to go direct. So that's one big change that we've certainly seen in the mindset of enterprises. I will be honest though, I do think that it's really at this point in time, whichever vertical you look at, it's really been only the leaders in those verticals who have sort of taken concrete steps. Because the reality is sort of, re-architecting your supply chain is something that is risky, but unfortunately at this time has become necessary. And I think only the leaders have really realized that it's time, for us to fundamentally alter the way our supply chains function. The two areas that certainly have come up a lot in discussion, one of them is a dramatically increased demand for visibility and transparency across the entire supply chain. In the earlier era, the approach was, if it's out of my factory gate, it's gone to the CNF agent, or it's gone to the distributor, or it's gone into retail, and I don't really care what happens to the product, down the line. More and more now we are seeing a demand for much greater transparency and visibility of products in transit, of products as they're getting delivered to businesses or to consumers. And the second big demand that's coming in is for efficiency and scale. Most enterprise customers were running supply chains which were suboptimal, subscale, and largely because there wasn't much focus. But now with the increased pressure and focus on the supply chain, I think a lot of companies are saying, look, how can we save money? And how can we become more efficient? And, I have a vested interest here, of course, but the reality is more and more companies are now starting to approach us saying, we would like an integrated solution. Earlier they would say, we do some of our warehousing ourselves. We have five different transportation partners, in some cases, 50 different partners. And companies are increasingly saying, we would like somebody who can orchestrate the entire chain for us. So I think those are the 2 or 3 big movements that we've seen in enterprise mindset.
I want to add a point to that. So what Sahil was talking about, and this is my view, and Sahil and Neeraj and Vivek, please correct me if you have a different view, that as companies go direct to consumer and logistics firms like Delhivery service that last mile, whether it's for direct to consumer businesses or it's for the horizontal marketplaces like Amazon, Flipkart, etc., there's an ability to glean some very useful real-time insight into consumer behavior. They're seeing last mile, what's being delivered, where, what quantity, what brand, what product, etc. So they have that information. Then the next step in that evolution obviously is to collect that data, structure that data, stratify it, and then at some point extract value and monetize it. So I think if you look, a year or 2 years forward, or maybe even less, I think that for last mile delivery firms that have that touch point with the end consumer, they've got to find a way to then figure out how to make or how to monetize the data that they have access to.
That's actually a very interesting point, and that ties back to brands themselves. So Vivek, back to you on this one. As you find that, earlier the availability of data in the long tail was either not there or poor quality or very fragmented. So nobody really knew what is happening right at the consumer end of things. But through digitized supply chains and access to consumer, as you develop more insight, what does that mean for business strategies moving forward? On mute, Vivek.
The power, of data, if harnessed properly, is the holy grail. I think companies have been struggling a lot with it, and I was on a panel with Manish Tiwari from Amazon a few weeks ago, and Manish Tiwari basically said that 2030 is the new 2020, right? As far as Amazon's plans are concerned. And I think Neeraj and Munish were both alluding to this acceleration. So I do believe that if we can harness the power of data right now, it can be a massive advantage, first of all, to crash product timelines. In the FMCG industry, typically it takes anywhere from 12 to 24 months to come up with a new product. We are doing it in weeks now, forget months. That's how, the product timelines are being crashed. Collaboration is increasing dramatically, both within, within the company and with external partners as well, to be able to collaborate in ways which was never imagined before. the data from the consumer will allow us to really come up with significantly tailored, customized, much more relevant value propositions. And hopefully we'll be able to bring costs down. Neeraj talked about increased cost consciousness. The reality is that as the economies go through a contraction over the next 12 to 24 months, there will be a flight to value. And so as Sahil was also mentioning, if we want to be efficient, if we want to bring costs down, I think that data will be very useful. So I do believe that you will start seeing much faster innovations, much more relevant innovations, much more cost-effective business models that will come out. And hopefully this will all allow us to be an increasing force for good. I think at the end of the day, as we want to be responsible businesses, if we can create more affordable, more relevant, more delightful products, I think at the center of all of this, Anjali, will be the ability to really get data from the consumer and make it far, far more relevant to our business models.
No, it's very well said. In fact, one of the other things I've seen over the last few months is in India, take for example, we've long talked about the digital divide between Bharat and India. So there is a part of India that is digitizing and moving forward in one direction, and there is another part that is actually still not really digitized. And even those have now started adopting digital in every form, whether it is in their commerce, in the way they do their business, it's their supply chains and ordering and payments particularly. And I'm referring now to the MSME space.
That's right.
We've seen the launch of e-Kirana, supported by the government, of course, but the launch of e-Kirana, the massive expansion of Jio, for example, into various new spaces, which have been made possible because there is a digital backbone. Agri, which was long, very much manual, very much fragmented, and not particularly digitized, even in its supply chain. I think the opening up of Agri with the amendment to essential commodities. So there's a lot of new things that will happen. So while India was very much on the digital adoption curve, the slope of the curve has suddenly become much steeper. So massively accelerating on digitization. On the enterprise side, and it has been mentioned earlier today by many of you, supply chain, which was not necessarily a boardroom topic, is now very much a boardroom agenda. Securing our supply chains, both geographically as well as from creating better redundancy, sometimes even saying, hey, you know, we'll build more inventory, take the cost, will have implications obviously for working capital. And somewhere it will hit company margins. It will then go into who takes the margin, right? Do you pass it on to your customer? Do you take it in the business and hence to shareholders? So I think a lot of things emerging out of this, mostly positive, but then I'm an optimistic. I think mostly positive. It will help create better, streamlined, more at scale, consolidated, frankly, a lot more transparent, traceable, trackable supply chains. As we speak about all of this, I think there'll be opportunity for investments that emerge as well. So Neeraj, as you look at the landscape, and Carlyle, of course, has been particularly active. We've seen a few things in the last week itself, which I have no doubt were cooking for a while, but how do you see opportunities for various companies in the supply chain space?
Yeah, so I think one is, as Vivek pointed out earlier, you know, the disruption is still ongoing, right? So you're talking about a situation where revenues are anywhere between, you know, 50 to 60% of what they were pre-COVID levels. And you've had a supply chain which has gone through tremendous disruption. So the profitability of most companies, the cash position of most companies is actually quite fragile at this point in time. So I'll get to specific themes, but at an aggregate level, we're seeing just many more opportunities to invest today because the need for capital is much higher. And for us, I think the areas we want to invest in, one is the preponderance of data, right? And how do you then enable it? So we just completed a deal in the data center space that would sort of be very, to your point about having a digital backbone, that's critical to having a digital backbone. We're looking at some security plays, right? Because you would start now having data, and the point was made earlier, it's not just about your enterprise, it's about your partner network and how you collaborate across people. So we're looking at security/collaboration tools, all delivered in a manner which is more SaaS versus the typical model of enterprise software. So that's a second theme for us coming out of supply chains. I think thirdly, as you know, we're very proud to be investors in Delhivery. So they've taken out the logistics opportunity to invest for us. But I think, opportunities where you are disaggregating physical from data, where you're disaggregating owned versus partnered, right? I think those kind of models and where you're creating flexibility in your network will be very interesting from a supply chain perspective. And then lastly, e-learning, right? I think both in terms of the traditional models of, frankly, at this point in time, given there's such a huge demand supply gap, people with very basic online platforms will actually do well in this space. But I think longer term, the online education platforms, which ensure true collaboration, true personalization, because with the penetration of online increasing, there's a real opportunity to increase personalization here. It's not just, it doesn't necessarily mean one form fits all. You can actually tailor your products or services to that individual. And then lastly, I think we're looking at tools which will enable as Munish was saying earlier, use the customer data at the endpoint for better business. So as an example, in the McDonald's situation, they've utilized some tools where they have now in McDonald's China, which we own, they have about 120 million of their customers using their digital app to order. And that's about 60% of McDonald's volume. And that obviously gives you a very good sense of what tastes and preferences are, but also they're able to actively market to customers when they see a dip in volume, right? So I think, enabling that data through your entire ecosystem to create a better business. And I think so those are sort of the 4 or 5 themes which we're looking at.
Munish, we touched upon briefly the emergence now of logistics at scale and supply chain at scale. You look at sort of global supply chains in some ways. So do you see opportunities emerging where large investors or innovative companies like Delhivery can actually drive that consolidation? And do you see opportunities coming up?
I think there's significant opportunity, right? So 2 points to make here. One, as you mentioned, right, that supply chain, and Vivek mentioned that as well, wasn't a boardroom topic before. It certainly is front, square, and center now, point one. Point two, that trade-off, and when we think of supply chain, you've got to think of both products and services, right? We talk about all the supply chain in the context of products, but there's a services supply chain as well, whether it's offshoring, nearshoring, all relevant discussion topics today. So, and the second thing that you mentioned, Anjali, was, look, just in time versus building redundancy, which has implications on cost, implications on margins, and who ultimately bears the cost. But these are all relevant conversations that are being had in boardrooms today, right? Given, and this is the point Neeraj is also making, given that margins are squeezed, we're in the middle of a pandemic, revenues are lower, there's a lot more opportunity for capital deployment. Clearly, there's a massive, or I wouldn't say massive, it's a significant consolidation opportunity, which companies like Delhivery, where the core business is doing very well, which is not just one part of logistics, it's last mile, FTL, LTL, enterprise, and e-commerce, should look at this opportunity with healthy, strong balance sheets where either they have gaps in their product portfolio or they have gaps in their sort of technical capability, then they should look to acquire and consolidate because scale has significant advantages here, right? In this business, it is a business that is driven, will be defined, and will be monetized with scale. So I think consolidation opportunities definitely. And there are other parts of logistics businesses which haven't been touched massively. If you look at freight forwarding, for example, as a business globally, right? We've seen limited innovation in freight forwarding. And if you look at any balance sheet of a freight forwarder, their cost to serve is 60-65% of revenue. Now that there's a huge amount of inefficiency there, and whether that gets tackled by building a platform for freight forwarding itself, or whether it gets tackled by reinventing how freight forwarding is actually done, all remains to be seen, and these are questions that we don't have answers for as yet. But definitely scouting for investment opportunities in this space, because there's enough to do, and it's a big space.
And it's a large part of any enterprise spend, and frankly, a large part of most countries' GDP as well. So, which brings me back, Sahil, there was a question around how did you guys think about logistics and supply chain when it came to a data-led, innovation-led business? And how has that all panned out?
Well, going back in time, perhaps.
And the reason I asked this specifically, while today, and Delhivery is actually a very large enterprise, but we are on a TiE platform, and I know that many viewers and participants will want to hear your story. How did you think about logistics and supply chain, and what did you do to innovate and make it data-led?
Sure. So I'll start with the disclaimer that I wouldn't necessarily advise the same path that we happen to take. I think the reality is we sort of realized we had a hypothesis about how we wanted to build the business, but we realized a lot of the truths that we realized over the last 10 years only along the way and not, at the start. Our view was very simple. One is that if you look at the Indian market is completely anomalous, right? When you look at the rest of the world, most economies of meaningful size have logistics companies of meaningful size. And it just makes sense because they bring scale, they bring transparency, efficiency. It's absolutely a critical sector to the economy as a whole. In the US, for instance, you have UPS, you have FedEx. In Western Europe, you have, DHL, the erstwhile TNT. China has 7 or 8 large logistics companies, all of which are over 10 billion in revenues. India's largest logistics companies are less than $500 million in revenues. And so it's a battle of the minnows, really. And to some extent, that's also why logistics in India has always been expensive. So India spends 14% of its GDP on logistics, a famous statistic. Mm-hmm. And it's largely because we're subscale and inefficient. So our view when we got in was perhaps driven by being naive to some extent, but it really was just that there has to be a better way and there has to be, a larger scale that can be built here. In the beginning, our view was very simple. We said, look, logistics is sort of fundamentally moving from the era of the FedExes and the UPSs of the world, which are marvelous feats of industrial engineering. But you're moving from the era of industrial engineering to an environment where decision-making can now be done in real time. And the old industrial engineering tropes don't work as well in an economy and in a world which is increasingly more real time. You have pressure from a consumer buys something online, and the minute the order is placed, starts tracking the order, hoping to get it, within 6 hours or the next day. And traditional businesses and traditional supply chain companies are simply not set up for those kinds of operations. Structure in network businesses is destiny. And so we started out with the view of building just a far more responsive and real-time logistics network. And so to that extent, the design of the network, the data that we needed, the massive amounts of data that we needed to be able to make these decisions in real time on how to route packages, how to deliver them to people, was ingrained into the company. We were fortunate that we'd worked in telecom. And so we had done modeling of what telecom networks look like. And so we sort of used that as an inspiration to build a logistics network. We said, look, what's the most efficient distribution network in India today? It's actually the distribution of voice and data packets to consumers' mobile phones. And can you build a logistics network that sort of operates the same way? And that's sort of how technology got ingrained into the company from the very beginning.
I suppose it would be a somewhat sort of moot point, but I must ask, how has it helped as you competed against large companies, other established, well-entrenched players, and frankly, enterprises that did not think of supply chain as a strategic agenda item? So one understands e-commerce, but how did you kind of break into enterprise? And I know Delhivery is now doing end-to-end on several situations.
So what it's allowed us to do is to really spin our core flywheel much faster than we would have in the absence of technology. As we think of delivery, there are 2 flywheels that we really operate. There's the logistics flywheel, which is where we establish high quality, large scale infrastructure, which allows us to operate at extremely low costs and, pandemic situations notwithstanding, quite reliably. And then the other side of the flywheel is the technology piece, which is where we're able to collect and parse through massive amounts of data, convert that to meaningful insight on things like location, products that we're carrying, seasonality, the identity of the consumers and the businesses that we're delivering to, and therefore become much more precise. Now, when we think about the business, what we were able to do was we launched the Express business, which is our e-commerce logistics business that we're really sort of better known for. And then we realized we were one of the largest buyers of part truckload and full truckload freight in the country, because that's essentially how our entire middle mile was being run. And so we borrowed perhaps a little bit from the Amazon playbook, which was really to say, when you want to launch a new service, it's good to be the largest consumer of that service to begin with. And so we launched our part truckload service. We were the largest consumer of our part truckload service. And then we externalized it to our own consumers, to our own clients, saying, look, we're anyway using this, and our requirements are significantly more stringent than yours. It works. We're able to trace our packages. They get delivered much faster. And so we externalized the part truckload network, after which we've externalized the full truckload freight exchange, externalized our warehousing services. And all of that's been possible because of the underlying technology that guides the orchestration of the network. The way we move freight is not particularly different from the way we move in our parcel network. The data that we're crunching through is fundamentally the same. It's location, product identity, and seasonality. And so the core elements of the infra and tech together. And I must point out that in logistics businesses like ours, it's not just the technology.
Mm-hmm.
You can go and build software. You can buy software as well. It's in how you blend the hard assets on the ground, the infrastructure and the people and the operations on the ground with the technology, and make them sort of, and put them in a virtuous cycle or a flywheel. That's made the difference for us.
Great. So fascinating. In fact, as we think about more and more, whether we call it omni-channel when it is consumer facing, or we call it phygital, it's the combination of the physical and digital that has to interplay and really create both efficiencies as well as, frankly, new opportunities. We are at 5:45. We have about half an hour to go. So I'm going to turn to some audience questions. And some very interesting questions have come in. So I'll start with first. How do industrial organizations, and I will expand that and say large companies in general, decide on how much to invest in technology? Since tech requirements and basis is not clear in the best of times, and particularly even more in uncertain times. Who can I turn this over to? Munish, Neeraj, your companies, how do you consider?
I was going to suggest Vivek.
Vivek, you've been nominated. How do you think about tech investment from an enterprise point of view?
I think, Anjali, we are getting better at this because the reality is in the past, ROI on tech was very elusive. So, for all the companies who invested so much in these big ERP platforms, and you ask them, how frustrated they have been in terms of being able to get the bang for the buck on their ERP investments. What's happened though is that I think the business case, the use cases of technology have become far clearer. And you've also seen the power of experimentation. And I think people have realized that whether it's through a SaaS model that Neeraj was mentioning, whether it's finding capable partners, not everything has to be done in-house. As a result of that, I think, you've been able to quickly be able to figure out, and even Sahil was mentioning, the ROI is pretty clear in many cases on, what the benefits of technology are. And once the benefits are clearer, I think it builds this momentum within the company, and it builds a much stronger case. And as technology becomes a bigger part of boardroom discussions, you will see the pendulum shift towards being able to figure out what the appropriate level of investment for technology is. And I do believe that companies now are taking increasingly long-term views, but long-term views are 2-3 years now. Before you had to have a 10-year business case to justify technology investments. Now the cost of technology have come down, the ability of partners has come down, you have best of breed players. And so I do believe now that companies are far more open to experimenting and finding the ROI from technology.
Just Anjali, adding to what Vivek said, I think the paradigm around technology investments has also changed from an enterprise perspective. It used to previously be viewed more as infrastructure. And I think now, to Vivek's point, is more about the business case. So that becomes easier to pinpoint an ROI. But I think to make that happen, you need to marry a CIO with a business head manager, right? So you need to have that combination of two individuals coming together to really figure out what is the use case and then how do you deliver it. If you end up in one silo or the other, the CIO will come up with this singing, dancing architecture, but it will take 10 years to implement, right? And if you purely go to the business case, there's not a true understanding. The normal responsibility, that data is never going to be available, right? So at least in my experience, when you marry the two together, that's when you get the best business case outcome and the best implementation as well.
In fact, and we are starting to see this in companies, right, where your tech person used to be tucked away in either the CFO's organization or some other organization, and now it's actually a senior role, and they are visible, and they come up and present their plans to the board, etc. So technology as an enabler, and frankly, technology is now no longer just an enabler or an opportunity. It is a must-have. It's CEOs get questioned as to where is your ERP, how are you using it, where is the cost saving, and so on. So I think that's a very interesting thought about bringing business and tech together so you create the right use cases in large companies. A very specific question on supply chain. Will companies move from a just-in-time supply chain to maybe more of a made-to-stock strategy? And I think we alluded to this a little bit earlier. So will we be seeing an increase in the market share of the organized sector due to supply challenges being faced by smaller companies? So will the big become bigger, and consequently there'll be less room or space for mid-sized companies or potentially smaller companies?
I think economies of scale, I'll have a stab at this. I think economies of scale are super relevant in this sector, right? So I do think that the bigger companies will get bigger, will take more market share. Companies that are nimble, and again, Sahil mentioned this when he started off, so within 2 days, they were at 5,000 PIN codes. Within a week, you were at 15,000 PIN codes. So companies, and you know what, business challenges, business interruptions will occur, will happen over time. You can't predict them. So companies that have proven that in times where supply chains are stretched or challenged, that they can respond faster, they can respond better, they can respond quicker, they will win a disproportionate share of wallet from enterprises. And I think if once you have that, and then that's a virtuous cycle, that the more scale you get, the more you can sweat your infrastructure, the better your cost per unit of shipment becomes. And then I actually think that that's a consequence that we will see, not just in logistics, we certainly will see it here, but in some other industries as well.
So give us a few more examples, Munish, going beyond supply chain, where do you see some of these consolidation trends?
So take any industry, right? That where you look at unit economics of any business, right? And again, a lot of unit economics where it's driven by scale. The more scale, the better the unit economics. And as long as there's no sort of floor beyond which it can't go, and if there is a floor in that sector, it will obviously get capped at that level. But if scale is going to drive efficiency, and it drives in most industries, right? It drives in most industries. I mean, Neeraj talked about EdTech will drive it there. Scale will drive across most industries. But scale is part of the thing. I mean, I think one of the points Neeraj made, which was a very relevant point, that when he spoke about EdTech was, look, right now there is such demand that any platform will do, right? But over time, who are going to be the winners will be people that can personalize content, right? So all these businesses that are tech-led, digital-led will do very well, but ultimately they have to keep evolving as well and finally getting to the point where tech is not an addition to the business, but it's meaningfully driving the business.
Right. No, a fair point. Interesting couple of questions on, I'd mentioned earlier about two spaces in India that were really not particularly digital yet. And so there are two questions that have come up. I'm going to combine them for Sahil, for you. Last mile part of supply chain in rural India has always been a challenge. And how do you see the digital way of doing business affect the last mile delivery in rural India? And similarly, keeping the supply chain up and running, taking SMEs and other small players so that it's a win-win situation. And how can automation actually help on-ground processes for these segments, rural and MSMEs? And having been involved, I know with some of the initiatives that Delhivery is pursuing right now. So I'll tell us a bit about what you are seeing in the digitization of supply chain in agri on the one hand, and then all the work that Delhivery has done through the lockdown and potentially new categories emerging on MSME through digitization.
So the agri space, we are new to it. We've been working in this space now for a few months so far. I think it's a gigantic space that has been completely untouched by technology and sort of the organized sector. There really aren't too many large organized players in the agri space other than the government. I think there's been a change in regulation recently, which allows farmers to go directly to the market. And I think that's extremely, that's probably one of the biggest positives that's come out. I think the two big opportunities that I can see in agri, one is in the entire sort of warehousing and storage and inventory management space, which is heavily fragmented. Even the large organized players in context of the market are extremely small. So I think there will be an opportunity to expand warehousing and supply in that space. And the other that at least we are starting to think of is in the supply chain financing space, which is linked to agri. We've started testing that model a little bit. Frankly, it's been baby steps for us right now, but our view is that that's one space which will get disrupted because the financing of the agricultural supply chain has largely been unorganized and extremely high cost. And I think with the data that supply chain firms sit on, or that we have the ability to generate, by orchestrating the supply chain, I think we can bring down the costs of financing in the agri supply chain. So I think those are two areas that we will be looking at. In terms of opportunities for SMEs, Anjali, are these SMEs in the logistics space or SMEs in general?
No, MSMEs. So how can the digitization of processes and supply chain for MSMEs actually help in either as an opportunity set for companies like a Delhivery, or really creating better business models for MSMEs themselves?
See, I think I'll go back to the earlier comment that I'd made, which is that MSMEs who have perhaps traditionally relied on more sort of offline brick and mortar old school ways of accessing the market, the big change will be when they access the market differently, now using the power of the internet, which is if you never sold online before, or if you haven't been able to get your products out there on a digital storefront, that I think will be step one. Doesn't matter whether it's B2C or B2B. I mean, the reality is that now, given the fact that stores have shut down, given the fact that the offline supply chain is relatively sort of, slow and inefficient, it makes most sense for them to start selling online. It makes most sense for them to reach consumers directly via these new channels. From how to bring down your costs, again, like I said, I have a vested interest when I say this, but the reality is there is a group of high quality logistics companies that is emerging, a group of high quality supply chain companies that's emerging across the country. We are one of them, there are several. And the reality is to work increasingly and make larger demands of the supply chain partners that you have, to integrate deeply with them, to demand transparency, visibility, to demand, service and reliability. And sort of to integrate your processes with them. Traditionally, again, the way people have operated is, I went to the shop, I dropped off my package and, somebody carried it and got delivered. But now being able to integrate with them and demanding that visibility and software, I think that's the big opportunity.
So I'll take a stab at that as well for the participant who asked the question. See, one of the things we are seeing emerge now, and this came out of necessity because there was no alternative post the lockdown, is both MSMEs as well as micro entrepreneurs, your everyday average bhajiwala, dudwala vendors actually adopt digital payments. The shopkeepers learned very quickly how to create a virtual shopfront either on WhatsApp or frankly on some of the other digital platforms that are now emerging that cater specifically to MSMEs. So the creation of a digital shopfront, the ability to take orders, which earlier they would take on the phone from a customer in the case of a kirana, but 80% of MSME business is actually with each other. And it is not necessarily with consumers, it is with each other. It is also not just product, but also services. The other aspect has been that for large enterprise supply chains, their upstream and downstream tend to be MSMEs. So for whether it's a Godrej or an HUL or any other large company, the input coming into the factory comes from either component manufacturers or ingredient intermediaries. And then downstream, the distribution is also all MSMEs. So because large companies have had to digitize their supply chain upstream and downstream, MSMEs have got digitized in the process because they've had to actually adopt some way of accepting orders, doing fulfillment and delivery and so on. So I think there has been it's a little bit like a demon moment where the shift to digital is somewhat irreversible. It is also leading to positive externalities where because they are now transacting digitally, they are visible. So they are more discoverable to the financing world. So earlier when they were deemed not particularly underwritable, now credit providers are finding them, you can actually understand the MSME business, see the transaction flow, do flow-based financing, for example. There are open commerce networks getting created. So once MSMEs start participating in that, and similar things are happening on the agri side, where the departure from the APMC and the mandi, and I'm not saying 100% departure, but the availability of alternative channels and particularly digital channels is creating lots of new business models there. So I think that has been a somewhat irreversible and a very positive shift of Bharat onto other digital platforms, both sort of supported by national infrastructure, but also through entrepreneurial, innovative startups. I'll come back to another question from the audience is, how does the panel see the future of omni-channel in India and the retail industry? Changing consumer behavior. Do you see offline retail coming back as a main source of revenue? So if any of you have investments in malls, if not, thankfully, then can you talk about retail?
No investments in malls, but I do believe that retail in India will be an omni-channel play. I think different countries, different verticals, different sectors will have different outcomes here. But from an Indian point of view, I think offline will come back at some point. Offline will not be, if you look at anyone supplying both offline and online, right, your margins are much higher online. And what the last 6 to 8 weeks have shown is that offline's been shot. There's been a lot more focus, a lot more attention on online and the ability to service the consumer online with the realization of better margins as well. So I think that shift where online takes an even more important role, that shift has occurred, that shift is permanent, that shift is here to stay, but it's not that there will be no offline presence. India retail will be an omni-channel play. And part of that then will have to get reflected in the supply chain behind it and the logistics behind it, because ultimately if the destination is retail, logistics companies have to be tailored to service both offline, which is what Sahil was alluding to in last mile e-commerce, and the offline fulfillment as well.
I also think, Anjali, that the roles might change a bit. So offline, to Munish's point, will come back, but it might be more about demand generation, product selection, right? And then the fulfillment happens online, right? And the reordering happens online. So I think the role will begin to segment a bit before, but it won't come back to the same degree it was earlier. I think you're already seeing that there's a number of people are closing down. You see the US model, a number of people have closed down stores. I don't think those stores are getting reopened now.
I completely agree. In fact, I think even in India, when in other forums, we are having conversations around what happens to commercial real estate. So large malls, retail footprint, rents, including office spaces and so on. But that's a conversation for another day. But certainly it's not going back fully offline as it used to be. There is going to be an omni-channel more and more, both from the point of view of sort of discovery experience, but transactions may happen elsewhere.
But I think, Anjali, one thing which I think you were also pointing out, which has been a surprise, has been the resurgence of the Kirana store.
Yeah,
now
absolutely.
We'll have to see how short-term or long-term that is. But at the end of the day, during the crisis, when people in India were struggling to find essential goods, guess what? E-commerce couldn't deliver, modern trade couldn't deliver, but the person who managed to get things for the consumer at the end of the day was the neighborhood Kirana store, who somehow or the other did the jugaad to find the things that you needed.
Right.
So we are seeing a resurgence. At the same time, obviously, online is growing quite rapidly. I think modern trade is going through a bit of a near-term challenge right now, given the location of some of the stores and reduced footfalls. The question becomes, will the Kirana stores now take advantage of this, right? And as you were saying, find a way to, either automate or use technology to their advantage. But to me, I think if the Kirana stores can find a way to take advantage of this near-term situation, it augurs well for them. But that's a big question mark still. Long-term, what happens to the Kirana stores?
No, very true. I mean, if Kirana stores can create their digital shop fronts and be able to link back up with the support of companies like Delhivery, direct to warehouses and distributors, and in fact reduce their real estate requirement in the store, there are absolutely new business models. And we hear of some very interesting, even for Kirana stores, when their next generation comes into the picture, they start thinking about how to do business differently. So it's a space which is very interesting to watch, but it's not going back to the old model in a full way. Here's a question, which is, as many countries now look at being more self-reliant, in India it's Atmanirbhar, but countries around the world are thinking about how to become more self-reliant. How does that actually impact economies of scale? So the unsaid question is this not detrimental thus to economies of scale with respect to global trade and supply chain? Let me start. So one of the things that I'm seeing is companies and saying, so earlier they spent many years trying to create this global manufacturing footprint. So let me talk manufacturing for a minute. And they find that, as part of a global supply chain, there is one widget, one component that is manufactured in India. India goes into lockdown, everything else is running. but they can't complete and ship their product from a factory in, I'm making this up, in Turkey, because the widget from India is not available. Similarly, in India, many of our companies have found that because borders are shut, freight is held up or at ports and so on. So they're saying, should we not just bring manufacturing more local? And this onshoring, nearshoring, that actually flies in the face of scale and efficiency.
Yeah, actually, my take is that if you take it to the extreme that is actually moving from offshore to nearshore, then yes, it is the diseconomies of scale. What I'm finding is you can take the pharmaceutical sector, which is paramount in this play, right? I mean, if you look at the pharmaceutical sector, it's gone through a couple of serious whiplashes in the last few months, right? You had China, which is sort of the sourcing hub for the global world, going through COVID. And then there've been supply chain disruptions in local markets because they've gone through COVID. And now you're getting hit by this concept of nationalism where people are trying to move onshore, right? So it's gone through three sort of massive, one ongoing, but the last two being major disruptions. I think what we're finding is more than diseconomies, you're finding that companies are figuring a way to navigate this, right? So having some sort of a presence in your major markets, right? If you're a supplier, so you are effectively somehow viewed as a local company, but then staying within your supply chain, within your operations, capturing the economies of scale by manufacturing wherever you were before is the way most people are getting around it, right? Because even for the end customer, the cost is still really important. It's not like customers' service level requirements have gone down, right? We all expect this from delivery. It's not that we're expecting anything less. We still expect the delivery on time from Amazon. It's the same thing. So I think what people are finding is if you take in the diseconomies of scale, the cost to serve is too high. So in a way to address, and nationalism is not being fueled, I mean, it's more fueled by the inherent ongoings within those countries versus the supply chain issue, right? So as long as you can figure out a way that you do the checkbox in nationalism and still have your supply chain where it was before, I think that's the way I've seen so far companies getting around it.
No, you're right. I mean, if you think about, there was a view that we don't import medicines. India is self-sufficient, but 70% of APIs come from China. And so regardless of the rhetoric around it, if their borders are closed, then you're stuck for whatever reason if borders are closed. So yes, certainly that will be impacted. I'm going to ask the panel a question from my side, and we have a few minutes left. There is one view emerging that this, the pandemic, the crisis, it's kind of the revenge of nature, so to speak. So will companies and consumers become more responsible and think about sustainability as an embedded part of how to do business and how to live life? Businesses and consumers both.
Yeah, Anjali, I can take a stab at
Or
this.
Vivek, if I may complete that, the more cynical part says that, all of this is fine. When all of this is lifted, we'll go right back to where we were.
And I think that's always a concern, because if you look at history, the highest number of births typically happen 9 months after a drought or a war, right? So I think people get back to their old, preferences and habits. Having said that, though, I do believe, a pandemic of this nature, which is a once in a lifetime, hopefully, for us, in some ways probably shakes us in ways we could have never imagined before. And I do believe that it will actually raise both our individual and a collective consciousness. So, you talked about resilience, Anjali, right? A big part of resilience supply chain is human resilience also. Yes. And I think the invisible worker, the migrant worker, all of a sudden, people are really missing their home help, and they're really realizing how valuable the invisible workers were. And so I do believe that, as we emerge out of this crisis, you will see a more responsible world. I don't think you will have a choice with social media also. The sense of purpose, the sense of scrutiny that companies will face. Look at Black Lives Matter all of a sudden. Look at what's been going on there. Companies that had been selling, fairness products for such a long time with every single excuse, right now have all of a sudden have had to change their product portfolios. Marketing campaigns are being changed. So I think the entire collective consciousness will force companies. I think investors will also demand a lot more. Consumers will demand a lot more. Employees will demand a lot more. So I do believe all of these will converge into a world that will be more responsible. a world that will be much more humane, more compassionate, and more sustainable.
No, and I would say amen to that. I hope that is exactly how it plays out. Two companies I admire a lot, and there are many I admire, but two that I admire, Tata Group and Levers, have actually long maintained that the purpose of business is not only to generate profit, but it's actually to serve the communities and have a far more holistic business and profit model. And in some ways, it is going back to basics. Any other thoughts on this sustainability? Sustainability and responsibility? Will you apply that lens as investors, Munish, Neeraj?
Yeah, I think you have to, right? And you should. I think that lens has to be applied. That lens is applied. The attention on that lens is even greater now. And as investors, we will obviously apply that lens in greater degree. As Vivek said, as individuals also, this pandemic has, everyone spent more time, at least I have, at home with my families, with your children, who might have been at home for the last 3 months. So I think it's brought some things more to the forefront of life, right? And I think in terms of going back, yes, human memory is kind of short, but I think hopefully at a personal level, I think all of us would take something away on the positive side from this experience, right? As to what's really important and the fact that you don't have to get onto a plane every time there's a meeting. Zoom has worked very well. So some fundamental shifts, changes, which will be positive in the long run.
And I think
absolutely. I think COVID has done more to reduce the collective carbon footprint of the world than any number of climate conferences.
Right.
I mean, look at this group. We haven't had to fly all over the place to come and do a session like this.
And it works just fine.
It does.
The important thing to remember here, I think, is sustainability is good business. And
yes.
So you mentioned Unilever, and they have the data which shows that what they call their purpose-driven brands are growing at a much faster clip, and I'm assuming more profitable than their other brands, because they do have some other brands in the portfolio. So I think ultimately, we will all realize that this is actually a better and also probably a more profitable way of doing business over time.
Certainly. Great. Munish, if I may, one question for you. SoftBank, big investor, an important investor. Not just, it's no more a startup ecosystem investor, but you kind of really move and shift industries. How do you see the opportunities in India from where you sit?
Sure. So India, look, as you said, has been a big market for us. We've invested quite heavily over the last few years in India. Our India investments, we've made some very good investments in India, including Delhivery. We are very excited, and to have partnered with Sahil and the team, it's doing very well. And we continue to see great opportunity here, Anjali. It's not, India continues to be a big focus for us. We opened an office in Mumbai. We've got a fully staffed team on the ground. And we are seeing in this new world environment, lots of exciting opportunities that we're quite engaged with as we speak in terms of making fresh investments. So India will continue to be a very important investment destination for us. It's done well so far. We've got good investments, and that will continue.
That's heartening for everyone in the startup and investment ecosystem, because we rely on SoftBank to provide some good large capital for growth.
Please, Neeraj, Bharadwaj has been super busy last month. There's no one busier.
And the next question is straight to Neeraj Bharadwaj, exactly for that reason. Neeraj, what is next? Come on, I can't let you guys go off this panel and not ask you these questions, even if it is only supply chain, really.
I see meeting happening here, Neeraj.
Oh, clearly. Look, the supply chain of capital is a very important supply chain.
No, it's a great time to invest. I think specifically with regard to India, even for us, as Munish said, it's been a very important market. I think what we're finding right now is, from an India perspective, for private equity and for long-term capital, if you have short-term disruption, right, but long-term you believe in the growth prospects, it's a great time to invest. And secondly, we're getting access to deals which we previously thought were unachievable, right? So big companies are trying to raise money. So I think it's the same sectors. I don't think the sectors are changing. I just think the availability of really great deals, which you can do right now, are coming to market. So I think we see ourselves, still being very aggressive in the market, and in our chosen sectors, financial services, healthcare, internet. Sahil has taken logistics out of the game, but everything around that we'll try to invest. And it's never. Having been investing here for 11 years now, this is the best it's ever been.
That's great. And Sahil, on logistics, strong balance sheet, robust operations, and I'm very biased, but let me just say, well, I think one of the best teams in the business period, in any business. How do you think about investing further in supply chain and logistics from the delivery point?
You meant best boards, right? Just want to check.
Well, that's for Sahil to say. That's his cue.
We're coming to the end, so I just want to give him the layup.
Sahil, that's your cue about the board?
No, I think I'm just going to, I think a front foot defense to the half volley in this case. But sure. In terms of continued investment in the supply chain, Anjali, that's what we do. Our business is pretty simple. Our job is to relentlessly keep doing the same thing that we've been doing for the last 10 years and to do it at larger and larger scale, and to keep doing it as long as we can. We are in all of the sort of verticals that we'd like to be in. We've expanded across parcel freight, warehousing, cross-border logistics, and so we do believe that we have a full stack. Now the challenge for us obviously is, with whatever, about 450 million in revenues. I think for us, the opportunity is to build, the aim is to build the largest logistics company of this entire region out of India. And so, I think we could be having this conversation in 2030 and I'll be saying pretty much the same things.
But with a much larger revenue number.
Hopefully.
And with some reference to the stellar board you have. I know there are a few of them on this.
That we have, absolutely.
Great. Well, thank you very much. It's 6:15. We are bang on time. It has been an absolutely wonderful conversation, lively, interactive, and thank you all for sharing very candid views. Munish, Vivek, Neeraj, Sahil. Thank you to TiE and Delhivery for bringing us all together.
Thank you, Anjali.
Thanks a lot, Anjali, and thank you to all the speakers. I mean, there's been a lot of food for thought, and especially, I think, thanks for keeping everyone's morale and confidence up and showing sort of steps take towards the light at the end of the tunnel. So I think that's been very, very encouraging in this discussion. Big thanks to Delhivery again for their partnership for this session. We'll see you all again very soon. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Stay safe, stay healthy.
Wash hands.
Bye.